The story of Ruth and Naomi actually goes back to the time of Moses.
You can't possibly be serious. You're kidding. You're clowning around, right?
No. The job of clown is apparently taken. Let me explain. Moses led the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. They were no longer slaves to the Pharaoh, and they were free. But the problem was that they had forgotten how to trust God.
Yo, you're not kidding about that. If they'd listened to God, they would have been out of there in 10 days instead of wandering around for 40 years.
Yeah, but they kept on rebelling and not trusting in God. So they stayed in the desert because it would take full trust in God to go live in the promised land. Well, some of you may know the story. After 40 years of wandering in the desert, how Joshua sent 2 spies to Jericho and they were kept safe by a prostitute named Rahab. She hid them when guards were looking for them and later led them down by a rope through the window, which meant they escaped the city because she lived in the outer wall of the city. This is an incredible story, partly because Rahab, a Canaanite, professes her complete faith in God. She and her family are spared because she protected the spies and believed in God. When the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, Rahab goes to live with the Israelites and God. She starts worshiping God right alongside the Israelites. A man named Salmon falls in love with her and they get married. Salmon and Rahab have a son and they name him Boaz. Boaz becomes a wealthy landowner in Bethlehem, and though he's a lot older than Ruth, he's not married by the time Ruth and Naomi arrive on the scene.
Wait a minute. Ruth and Naomi? That's a different story entirely. Surely you can't be serious.
No, it's you who can't be serious, clown. And don't call me Shirley. Ruth and Naomi arrive in Moab. Naomi was originally an Israelite from Moab, but there was a famine and her husband Elimelech decided to move to Moab. Their sons, Mahlon and Chilion, grew up and married local women. By then, Naomi's husband was dead, and then tragically, her 2 sons died. Naomi was left with her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, but no grandchildren. In a culture where children and grandchildren were everything, this was harsh. Mothers and grandmothers lived in houses with their offspring. If they didn't have offspring, there was a problem. Women were not permitted to inherit property. So Naomi's future was in shambles. The best she can hope for in Moab is to become a household servant. Then at least she'd have food and maybe a place to sleep. This wasn't a particularly good option. Naomi had kin in Bethlehem, and perhaps she could find a place there. She decided to give it a try. As Naomi left for Bethlehem, Naomi commanded Ruth and Orpah to return to their families so they could start new lives. They could still get married, after all, and start a family. Naomi blessed them, asking that they find security in the house of a new husband. Orpah left, but Ruth said to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, may it be ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Wow. This was such a strong show of love and devotion to both God and Naomi that this statement has remained powerful throughout the centuries. Naomi had obviously lived her faith in God before Ruth, and Ruth learned to love God, and she also was clearly strongly attached to Naomi. But traveling to Bethlehem was a long journey and extremely dangerous. 2 widowed women traveling alone on a dangerous roads with no place they could call home was practically destined for failure. And Naomi and Ruth had no security as women in a man's world. No security when they traveled, no security in money, no security in any way. For Ruth, it was a worthwhile trade. She traded her material security of looking for a husband in her own country for her spiritual security in God. She would rather die with God than live without God. Ruth and Naomi make it to Bethlehem, and they need to eat. Ruth finds a field where the Mosaic law is followed. In Mosaic law, farmers were to leave some of the crop to be gathered by those in need. I imagine it might have been difficult for Ruth to find land where people didn't shut her out or treat her poorly because she was an outsider. I mean, the poor who are part of one's own culture, gathering food was one thing, but a foreigner, that could be a totally different thing. Now, Ruth is a hard worker. She works from early in the day, only taking a short break throughout the day. People start to notice this foreigner named Ruth and how she treats Naomi. And of course, some of them knew Naomi as she was growing up, as she was from there. And do you know what they're saying? They're saying that Ruth is kind to Naomi and loyal. Ruth was an incredible person. The owner of the land where Ruth was gleaning enough grain to keep herself and Naomi from starving was Boaz. Yes, the same Boaz I talked about earlier, who was the son of Salmon and Rahab. Boaz instructed his workers to not harm Ruth and for them to leave food for her. He was very kind to this outsider, Ruth. And Boaz was older but not married, which seems strange. Here was a rich man but not married in a culture where being married and having children was everything.
It makes you wonder if he was seen as a little different. I mean, people notice differences. They might notice your clothes or the way you act, or they might never forget little details like the fact that both of your parents were not Israelites, like Boaz. His mom had been a Canaanite, and not only a Canaanite, but a prostitute. And prostitutes were not highly regarded in Israelite culture. People tend to not forget details like that.
So true. The fact that Boaz's mom, Rahab, had a strong faith in God wouldn't matter to some people. She'd have remained an outsider to some, no doubt, and Boaz might have been teased as a kid and also marked as different, also a sort of outsider. When Boaz became rich, he obviously had a kind heart for outsiders and those in need. Now, Boaz having a stigma of being a bit of an outsider might have also been why he wasn't married yet. Who knows? What we do know is that Boaz is a very good Jew. He takes his obligations before God very seriously. There was one law of God that Jews followed in order to protect childless widows because, as I pointed out before, childless widows had nowhere to live. There were no nursing homes, nowhere set up for widows to live other than their children's homes. Here is the law from Deuteronomy. When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage, and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. The rule talks about brothers, but it was also extended to cousins. Naomi and Ruth were in the category of childless widows, so this rule could be applied to them, or at least to Naomi, because she was a Jew. Naomi was too old to bear children, but Ruth was not. There were two men in Bethlehem who were near relatives to Ruth's husband, Mahlon, who could marry Ruth and be what they called a kinsman redeemer. The firstborn of Ruth and a kinsman redeemer would perpetuate Mahlon's lineage, and any other children after that would be considered the children of the kinsman redeemer. The closest kinsman redeemer to Ruth's dead husband Mahlon didn't want the job. The next closest kinsman redeemer was Boaz. After some crafty matchmaking by Naomi, Ruth ends up marrying Boaz. This is quite the thing because Ruth was a foreigner. Boaz didn't really have to be a kinsman redeemer for a foreigner. So Boaz showed Ruth great mercy and grace and love by accepting her and taking her as his wife. His heart was close to God's heart as he ignored the resentment some people held against foreigners and did what was good in God's eyes. Ruth, for her part, showed great faith in God. She threw away the gods she grew up with and wanted to follow only the God of Naomi. Ruth showed great care and love for Naomi and did what was good in God's eyes. When Boaz and Ruth got married, they were a couple faithful to God. They would have been blessings to those around because of their love and care for others, and they, along with Naomi who lived with them, would have passed on their devotion to God to their children. Well, we hear in the Bible about Ruth and Boaz's first son. They name him Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, who was the father of King David. And Jesus was of the line of King David. The fact that the line of King David and Jesus go back to Ruth, a foreigner, and Rahab, a foreigner and a prostitute, is profound. It's not your background that counts. What counts is where your heart lies.
And that's no joke. Seriously.
Okay, it's a bit hard to take you seriously right now, but seriously, where does your heart lie? I mean, do you choose to put your security in God or elsewhere in every aspect of your life?
Every aspect?
Every aspect. For instance, do you trust in God for your future?
Trust in God so much that you keep knocking out anxiety over the future if it keeps trying to knock you down.
Yes, put your security in God and not in your anxiety. Hard to do for many. And do you trust in God enough to obey God when God clearly tells you to donate something, but you want to hold on to your resources?
Trust God so much that you trust God with your finances.
Yes. Obviously, you don't want to donate to everything as you'd be out on the street, but sometimes donating for people is hard, and if we don't do what God calls us to do, it can narrow the flow of God's power in our lives. And one more thing, just so you get the idea. Do you trust in God enough to get up each day and give it to God, whatever happens?
Whatever happens? That's crazy. I mean, bad stuff could happen.
Trust in God right in the midst of bad stuff? Not easy.
But doesn't my security in the day depend on my hard work?
Tom, you're a clown.
Yes, but it can be hard work to be upbeat and silly, especially when my day is not going in an upbeat and silly way. I mean, okay, you're telling me to put my security in God every day, no matter what happens, and then what?
You're at peace.
At peace?
At peace. The more you put your trust in God, the more you let God be your security in all areas of your life, the more of God's peace you'll be able to feel in your life, and joy.
So I could be even more joyfully silly and even happily peaceful as a clown who puts his security in God?
You said it. Let's pray. God, help each of us to stop today and think about where we place our security. Is it in you or something or someone else? And if we need to become more secure in you in some area or areas of our life, please help us. Help us to diligently seek you and find our life in you and your life in us as we travel each day together. Amen.